The morning Mrs. Cornelius read the inheritance letter aloud, every child in the hall laughed. Not nervous laughter, not the uncertain kind that comes when people aren't sure if something is supposed to be funny. This was the full, grateful laughter of children who had been told for years that they were worthless, and who were now watching someone discover she was worth even less. The benches creaked as bodies rocked back. The cook, Mrs. Arnett, covered her mouth by the kitchen door, but her shoulders shook with the effort of holding it in. Even Mr. Peters, the county clerk who had brought the letter, looked away and pressed his lips together like he was trying to swallow a smile. Mrs. Cornelius stood at the podium, a tall, thin woman with a face like a closed door, all vertical lines and no welcome, wearing the same gray dress she wore every day, buttoned to the throat. She waited for the laughter to fade. Then she folded the letter, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "The Whitmore coffin. How fitting. Every Whitmore woman has died on that land, and now the county can stop paying for your meals while you go join them. I suppose even the dead need company." I was 16 years old. I had $2.37 saved from 14 months of mending work, hidden in the lining of my only good dress. It was everything I owned in the world. My mother died of typhoid fever when I was 9. My father was killed in a logging accident 3 years later. A cable snapped, and I was standing at the tree line with his lunch when it happened. I watched the whole thing. My sister Emmeline, who was 18, tried to care for me after that. She died the following winter when a blizzard trapped us in our rented room and rats destroyed our flour supply. Emmeline starved over 11 days while I watched, too weak myself to walk for help. I survived only because a neighbor finally broke through the snow. I was 14, 4 months with Aunt Vera in Charleston, who found my silence unnerving and my habit of checking food stores obsessive. 7 months with the Hendersons, a farming family who needed help with their children, but couldn't afford another mouth when the crops failed. 5 months with the widow Parsons, who called me touched because I couldn't sleep through the night without checking the pantry. And 14 months at the Braxton County Home for Indigent Children, where Mrs. Cornelius ran a tight ship and an empty kitchen, and where the other children called me the Rat Girl because of the way I hoarded bread under my mattress. The inheritance was 43 acres and a collapsed cabin in a hollow 9 miles from Sutton, the Whitmore coffin, they called it, because 2 Whitmore women had already died there, and everyone in Braxton County was waiting for the third. The cabin's west wall had fallen in. The sawmill hadn't run in 15 years. The land was too steep and rocky for farming, too picked over for logging. My great-aunt had bought it at a tax auction in 1889 for $11, when nobody else would bid. She had lived there alone for 30 years, and the town called her crazy. She had died there alone, and by the time anyone found her, the story had already hardened into fact. That's what happens to Whitmore women. They go to the coffin, and they don't come back. Mr. Peters read from the inventory. 1 cabin, partial collapse. 1 sawmill, non-operational. 17 notebooks, contents unknown. 17 notebooks. Something caught in my chest when I heard those words. My great-aunt had written things down. She had studied something. She had been a woman alone in that hollow for 30 years, and everyone said she was crazy, but she had filled 17 notebooks with something important enough to save. I looked at Mrs. Cornelius. I looked at the other children, still smiling. I thought about Emmeline dying while the rats ate our flour. I thought about every family that had taken me in and put me out. I thought about the way Mrs. Cornelius counted the bread each morning to make sure no one had taken more than their share. Something lit up inside me. Not hope. I had stopped believing in hope a long time ago. Something harder than hope. Something that felt like the first spark of a fire that would either warm me or burn the whole thing down. If you want to find out what I built in that hollow, how a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but $2 and a habit of watching people work turned a collapsed cabin and 17 notebooks into something that saved 11 families from the worst blizzard in 50 years, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I found in those walls, what my great-aunt had spent 30 years figuring out while everyone called her crazy, that's a story that's still keeping people alive in those mountains today. I left 2 days later. Mrs. Cornelius didn't say goodbye, and I didn't ask her to. I carried everything I owned in a flour sack, 1 dress, a comb missing 3 teeth, and $2.37 in pennies that clinked against each other like they were embarrassed to be so few. The county clerk, Mr. Peters, gave me a ride in his wagon for the first 3 miles. He was a quiet man with a tobacco-stained beard and hands that stayed on the reins like he was afraid to look at me directly. When the road narrowed to a path, he pulled up and cleared his throat. "This is as far as I go," he said. "The Whitmore place is another 6 miles, give or take. You'll know you're close when the road stops being a road." He was right about that. The path became a suggestion, then a rumor, then nothing at all. I pushed through blackberry brambles that grabbed at my dress like hands trying to pull me back. By the time I saw the clearing, my only good dress was torn in 3 places, and my arms were scratched from wrist to elbow. Late afternoon light came through the trees at a sharp angle, and for a moment, just a moment, the hollows looked almost peaceful. Then I saw the cabin. The west wall had collapsed outward like a broken rib. I could see straight through into what had been the main room, the stone fireplace still standing, but everything around it open to the weather. The roof sagged in the middle like it was tired of holding itself up. Mice had been living in the walls long enough to consider the place theirs. Their droppings covered the floorboards like dark snow. I stood at the edge of the clearing and felt something cold settle in my chest. This was worse than Mr. Peters had described. This was worse than I had imagined, and I had imagined bad things. The sawmill was a skeleton 50 yards from the cabin. Rusted iron and rotting wood, the water wheel frozen in place by 15 years of accumulated debris. The stream ran past it, at least, clear water over smooth stones. That was something. You can't buy a stream. I walked the perimeter of the property as the light faded. 43 acres of steep, rocky ground. Second-growth timber, nothing worth logging. The remains of what might have been a garden, now wild with weeds taller than my head. A root cellar with a collapsed entrance. An outhouse that leaned so far to the left I was afraid to open the door. The Whitmore coffin, that's what they called it. 2 Whitmore women had died here, and everyone in Braxton County was waiting for the third. I didn't have anywhere else to go. The one intact room was the bedroom. The door still hung on its hinges, and when I pushed it open, the smell hit me. Old dust, mouse nests, something that had died in the walls and gone back to earth. But the stone fireplace still had its chimney. The floorboards were solid except for one rotted section near the window, and the bed frame, though rusted, still stood. I spent the last hour of daylight clearing out the worst of the debris. Mouse nests in the corners. A bird's skeleton on the windowsill. Someone's old boot, cracked and curled, stuffed with newspapers from 1891. I dragged the straw mattress outside, it was beyond saving, and found beneath it a horse blanket that smelled of mold but hadn't rotted through. That first night, I slept on the floor with my flour sack as a pillow, wrapped in a blanket that had been meant for an animal, listening to the sounds of the hollow settle around me. Wind through the collapsed wall. Something small moving in the darkness. The stream running past the frozen sawmill, going where it had always gone, indifferent to whether I survived. I had $2.37. I had no tools. I had no food except a handful of dried beans Mrs. Arnett had pressed into my hand when I left the children's home, charity given in secret against Mrs. Cornelius's rules. I was 16 years old, alone on a piece of land that had killed the last 2 women who tried to live on it. And I would have stayed that way, just another girl waiting to die in the mountains if I hadn't gone looking for something to burn. The next morning, I needed kindling. The fireplace worked, but I had nothing to put in it except what I could find. I spent an hour breaking dead branches from the fallen wall, stacking them by the hearth. Then I started looking inside. The intact room had little to offer. A 3-legged stool, a cracked wash basin, curtains that fell apart when I touched them. I was about to give up when my foot caught on a loose floorboard near the fireplace. I knelt down. The board was loose enough to lift with my fingers, and when I did, I saw oilcloth. Something wrapped carefully and stored beneath the floor, the way you store things you don't want to lose. Underneath the oilcloth was a tin box. And inside the tin box, packed tight and wrapped in leather bindings, were 17 notebooks. I pulled one out and opened it. The handwriting was precise, small, the letters leaning slightly to the right. Diagrams filled the margins. cross-sections of walls, measurements in inches and feet, calculations I didn't understand. At the top of the first page, a date. March 14th, 1876. I opened another notebook. More diagrams. Temperature readings logged over weeks, months, years. Comparisons: grain versus sawdust, straw versus mud, sealed versus ventilated. Numbers in columns, conclusions written below in that same careful hand. I didn't understand what I was holding. Not yet. I opened the 14th notebook. This one was different. No diagrams. Just writing, page after page. The entries dated and spaced like a journal. The first entry I read was from November 1889. The temperature differential continues to hold. 17 degrees warmer inside the grain cavity than the sawdust control. The wheat is maintaining its insulating properties even in extended cold. If I am right about this, and I believe I am, then everything they told me about winter is wrong. I sat down on the floor. My hands were shaking, but not from cold. I kept reading. The notebooks were my great-aunt's life. Maren Whitmore. I had never met her. I knew nothing about her except what Mrs. Cornelius had told me, that she was a Whitmore, that she had died alone in this cabin, that she was crazy. The last word delivered like a verdict. But these notebooks were not the work of a crazy woman. They were the work of someone who had spent 31 years trying to solve a single problem. How does a woman alone survive the mountain? I read for 3 days. I read by daylight streaming through the collapsed wall. I read by firelight when the sun went down, burning the last of my dead branch kindling. I read until my eyes ached and my stomach cramped from hunger I was trying to ignore. The notebooks were organized by topic. The first 3 covered wall construction, double walls with a 2-inch gap, the gap lined with salvaged tin sheeting. Notebooks 4 and 5 documented experiments with different insulating materials. Sawdust rotted, straw attracted mice, mud cracked in cold and crumbled in heat. But grain, dry, hard winter wheat sealed in a tin-lined cavity. Grain was different. Experiment 23, Maren wrote in 1896, grain-filled cavity, temperature differential, 17 degrees warmer than control cabin. Conclusion: the wheat works. God help me, the wheat works. Notebooks 6 through 8 covered sawmill operation, how to maintain the blade, how to repair the water wheel, how to process lumber alone without a partner to hold the other end. She had figured it out piece by piece, making mistakes and recording them, so whoever came after wouldn't have to. Notebooks 9 and 10 covered metalwork, how to cut tin sheeting, how to fold seams, how to solder for a watertight seal. She had taught herself, using scraps bought from the mill down river. And notebooks 11 through 14, these were the plans. Complete cabin designs with every measurement specified, material lists with quantities, step-by-step instructions written as though she expected someone else to follow them. She had expected someone else to follow them. I found the entry on the 3rd day in the middle of Notebook 14. The date was October 1891. Maren was 54 years old. I'm alone in this hollow. I have been alone for 19 years now. Everyone I loved is gone. Everyone who knew me is gone. But I am still here. I built something true, and the mountain is keeping me alive. And someday, someone like me will come here. Another woman alone. Another woman with nothing. And these notebooks will be waiting for her. I will teach her even though I will be long dead. And she will not be alone, because I will be with her in these pages. I sat on the floor of that ruined cabin, holding my great-aunt's journal, and I wept. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming recognition that I had been expected. That Maren had built this. All of it. 31 years of careful work, not just to survive, but for whoever came after. For me. I was not alone in this hollow. I never had been. 2 pages later, I found the quote that would stay with me for the rest of my life. They will tell you that a woman alone cannot survive the mountain. They are wrong. The mountain does not care who you are. It only cares what you have built. Build something true, and the mountain will keep you alive. I closed the notebook. I stood up. My legs were stiff from sitting on the floor for hours, and my stomach was hollow. I had eaten the last of Mrs. Arnett's beans the night before. I looked at the collapsed wall, the rusted sawmill through the gap, the 43 acres of rocky, worthless land stretching out into the hollow. "I'm going to build your cabin, Aunt Marion," I said out loud. "I'm going to prove you were right." The hollow didn't answer, but I hadn't expected it to. 3 days later, Harlan Jessup told me my great-aunt was crazy. I had walked 9 miles to Sutton because I needed supplies. $2.37 wouldn't buy much, but it could buy flour and salt, maybe some lard if the prices were fair. Enough to survive another 2 weeks, long enough to figure out my next step. Jessup's hardware and general store sat at the center of town, a 2-story building with a sagging porch and a painted sign that had faded to illegibility. Harlan Jessup himself stood behind the counter, a thick man with a red face and a mouth that seemed designed for frowning. He looked at me like I was something the cat had dragged in and regretted. "You're the Whitmore girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "The one living up at the coffin." I felt my spine stiffen, but I kept my voice level. "The one living at the Whitmore property?" "Yes, sir." He laughed. Not a friendly laugh, the kind of laugh that invites other people to laugh along. The 2 men standing by the stove looked up. A woman examining fabric in the corner turned to watch. "You planning to live up there alone?" Harlan asked. "With what money? What supplies? That sawmill's been dead 15 years. The cabin's half collapsed. Your great-aunt was crazy, and crazy is what killed her." My great-aunt wasn't crazy. She lived alone in the mountains for 30 years, talking about tin walls and weed insulation and numbers that don't mean anything to anyone but her. She ordered books from the East. She rejected 2 perfectly good marriage proposals. She died alone in that cabin and nobody found her for 2 months. He leaned forward on the counter. "That's not crazy to you?" "She was doing experiments." "Experiments?" He said it like it was a curse word. "You planning to do experiments too? Play scientist up in the hollow? You'll be dead by December. That's what happens to Whitmore women." The men by the stove laughed. The woman examining fabric shook her head and clicked her tongue. "I bought my flour and salt. I didn't have enough left for lard." I walked 9 miles back to the hollow, with Harlan's laughter still ringing in my ears. He was wrong about Marin. I knew that. I had read her notebooks. I'd seen her diagrams, her calculations, her years of careful observation. She wasn't crazy. She was the only person in this county who had tried to solve the problem that killed women like us. But Harlan was right about one thing. I was going to die if I couldn't figure out how to follow her plans. The notebooks assumed resources I didn't have. They assumed tools. They assumed money. They assumed someone who knew how to work a sawmill, shape tin, construct double walls with precise measurements. Marin had spent 31 years learning these skills. I had nothing but her notes and my own stubbornness. I sat in the one intact room that night, reading by firelight, trying to understand the gap between what I knew and what I needed to know. The flour and salt would last 2 weeks. After that, I would have nothing. No money, no food, no one coming to help. 2 weeks to figure out how to survive. The first 3 weeks nearly killed me. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. The flour ran out after 12 days. The salt lasted a little longer. I could make a pinch stretch. But salt without food is just salt. By day 15, I was eating whatever I could find in the forest. Ramps that grew wild along the stream. Dandelion greens, bitter and tough. Wood sorrel that my father had shown me once years ago, when I was too young to understand why I might need to know. Crawfish from the stream. They were hard to catch, and there wasn't much meat on them, but they were protein. I ate them with their shells still on because I couldn't afford to waste anything. By the 3rd week, my hands shook when I tried to do anything precise. My vision went gray at the edges when I stood up too fast. I had lost weight I didn't have to lose. My dress hung on my shoulders like it belonged to someone else. At night, I dreamed about bread, about butter, about sitting at a table where someone put food in front of me and I didn't have to wonder where the next meal was coming from. The morning I almost left, I woke up before dawn with my stomach cramped so tight I couldn't stand straight. The fire had gone out during the night. The room was cold enough to see my breath, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I thought about walking back. I could go to Sutton. I could find Mrs. Cornelius and beg to be taken back. The children's home was bad, the food was thin, and the work was hard, and Mrs. Cornelius watched us like we were criminals waiting to steal. But it was food. It was a roof. It was warmth. I could give up. I got as far as the edge of the property. The path back to Sutton started there, winding down through the hollow, eventually reaching the road that led to town. 9 miles. I could walk it by afternoon if I started now. I stood at the trailhead and thought about my sister. Emmeline had starved over 11 days while I watched. The rats had gotten into our flour, and the blizzard had sealed us inside, and we had nothing to eat except what we could scrape from the corners of the pantry. She had given me her portions when we still had portions to give. She had told me it would be all right, that help was coming, that I should sleep and save my strength. She had died on the 11th day, in the bed next to mine, so quiet that I didn't know she was gone until I woke up and found her cold. I was not going back, not to the children's home, where Mrs. Cornelius rationed food like it was punishment. Not to the families who had taken me in and put me out, one after another, when I became more trouble than I was worth. Not to any place where I would depend on someone else to decide if I lived or died. I turned around and walked back to the cabin. That afternoon, I caught a rabbit. I set a snare from bootlaces, the way my father had shown me once when we were camping in the mountains, and he wanted me to know how to survive. I don't know how long I sat motionless by that snare, waiting. Hours. My legs went numb. My fingers stopped feeling like fingers. But when the rabbit came through, when the snare tightened and I lunged forward and caught it before it could escape, I felt something inside me shift. I was not going to starve. I was not going to lie down and die in this hollow like everyone expected. The forest saved me that first spring. Barely. I lost 12 pounds I didn't have to lose. My dress hung on me like a sack. My hands were raw from foraging, my knees bruised from crawling through underbrush looking for anything edible. But I didn't leave. I hadn't touched the sawmill yet. The sawmill changed everything. I started working on it in late May, when the worst of my hunger had faded, and I had enough strength to do more than survive from meal to meal. The garden was planted, wild seeds mostly, things I'd scavenged from the overgrown beds Marin had left behind. The forest was providing enough to keep me alive. Now I had time to do something other than find food. The water wheel was frozen in place by 15 years of debris, branches, leaves, silt, all of it compacted into a mass that had fused with the wooden paddles. I spent 3 days just clearing enough to see what I was working with. The wheel itself was damaged but not destroyed. 3 paddles were rotted through. The axle was rusted but still turned when I put my whole weight into it. The blade, 8 feet of toothed iron, was dull and spotted with rust, but it wasn't broken. I could fix this. I was sure I could fix this. Marin's notebooks told me how. Pages and pages of sawmill maintenance, blade sharpening, water wheel repair. She had figured it out alone, and she had written it down so that whoever came after could figure it out too. The problem was that I didn't have the tools. A sawmill needs files for sharpening. Replacement paddles need to be carved from seasoned wood. The water wheel needed grease that I couldn't afford. And the blade itself needed 2 people to handle safely, one to hold, one to file. I did what I could. I cleared debris. I scraped rust. I used a rock to knock loose the worst of the compacted silt around the wheel. By the end of June, the wheel could turn, stiffly, grudgingly, but it turned. Then I tried to sharpen the blade alone. The blade was mounted on a cradle that could be tilted for maintenance. I tilted it. I braced it with stones. I took the only file I had, a small one I'd found in the ruined tool shed, and started working on the nearest tooth. 2 hours later, my hands were blistered and bleeding. I had sharpened maybe 1/10 of the blade. There were 200 teeth. I sat on the ground next to the sawmill and looked at my hands. The blisters were already filling with fluid. Tomorrow they would hurt worse. The day after that, they might crack and bleed. I didn't know what to do. That was when Thomas Harkins arrived. I didn't hear him coming. The stream was loud, and I was too tired to pay attention to anything except my own breathing. But when I looked up, he was standing at the edge of the clearing, a man so old and weathered he looked like he'd been carved from the same wood as the trees. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the sawmill, at me sitting on the ground, and my bloody hands. Then he walked to the water wheel and started pulling debris from the paddles. I stood up. "Who are you?" He didn't turn around. "Name's Thomas Harkins. I ran a sawmill downriver for 40 years. Sold scrap tin to your great-aunt for 15 of them." "You knew Marin?" He stopped working, turned to face me. His eyes were pale blue, faded like old denim, but there was something sharp behind them, something still alive. "I visited her cabin twice," he said. "Saw what she was building. She explained it to me. The grain walls, the tin lining, the temperature differential. I thought she was the smartest person I'd ever met. Smarter than any man in this county." "Then why? Why didn't I tell anyone?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because I was a coward. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy too. So I kept my mouth shut, and she died alone. And I've been living with that for 4 years." He turned back to the water wheel, started clearing debris again. "I'm too old to work a mill myself anymore," he said. "My hands shake. My back gives out if I lift anything heavier than a bucket. But I can still teach. I can still show a young woman how to do what I spent 40 years learning." He looked over his shoulder at me. "If you'll have me." I didn't know what to say. For a moment, I couldn't speak at all. Then I said the only thing that mattered. "Yes." Thomas smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was real. "Your great-aunt was the smartest person I ever knew," he said. "Smarter than any man in this county. They called her crazy because they couldn't understand what she was building. I understood. I just didn't have the courage to tell anyone." He picked up a rotted paddle and examined it. "Now I'm old and useless and too late. But I can still work a sawmill. I can still teach a young woman what I know. If you'll have me." "You said that already." "Did I?" He shrugged. "I forget things sometimes. My son used to tell me I repeated myself. Before he stopped. Set down the paddle." Didn't finish the sentence. I learned later what he didn't say. His son Daniel, crushed by a rolling log at age 26. His wife Mary, who stopped eating after Daniel died and was gone 6 months later. Thomas had sold his mill for drinking money, drunk it all away, and spent the last 4 years doing odd jobs and waiting to die. But he wasn't dead yet, and neither was I. We started working on the sawmill together the next morning. Thomas taught me everything. How to sharpen a blade properly, the angle of the file, the rhythm of the stroke, the way you count teeth so you don't miss any. How to carve replacement paddles from seasoned wood, measuring twice, cutting once, fitting them into the wheel until they sat flush with the others. How to grease the axle with rendered fat. How to check the alignment. How to listen for the sounds that meant something was wrong. By July, the water wheel turned freely. By August, the blade was sharp enough to cut. The first time we made a clean cut, I stood in the sawmill and listened to the sound of the blade biting into wood, and I felt something I hadn't felt since before Emmeline died. I felt like the future might actually exist. Thomas stayed through the summer and into the fall. He didn't live at the cabin. He had his own place downriver, a one-room shack where he'd been waiting to die, but he came every morning at dawn and stayed until the light faded. We processed lumber together, cleared more of the property, started rebuilding the collapsed wall of the cabin. By September, I had cut and milled enough lumber to begin the real work, building Marin's grain wall cabin, according to her plans. The setback came in August of the following year. I'd been working for 14 months. The sawmill was operational. The cabin's frame was complete. I had shaped tin sheeting for weeks, following Thomas's lessons, learning how to fold and seal the metal so it would be watertight and rodent-proof. And finally, I was ready to test the system. I built one section of double wall, filled the cavity with wheat, sealed it according to Marin's instructions. 3 months later, I opened it. The grain was moldy, ruined. Moisture had gotten through my tin seams, and the whole section had rotted from the inside. I sat on the floor of the cabin and stared at that ruined wall for a long time. Thomas found me there an hour later. He didn't say anything. He just sat down next to me and waited. "It failed," I said finally. I can see that. The seams leaked. I thought I had them tight, but folded seams won't hold against moisture, Thomas said. Not in these mountains. The humidity gets into everything. He looked at the ruined section. Your aunt knew that. That's why she soldered. The notebooks said, the notebooks assumed you knew to solder. Marin could solder in her sleep by the time she wrote those instructions. She probably didn't think to explain it. I looked at him. Can you teach me? He nodded slowly. I can teach you. It'll take a few months. You'll need equipment we don't have, but yes, I can teach you. I tore down the ruined wall section the next day. Started over, by October of 1909, the cabin was finished. 14 months of work. 2,000 board feet of lumber, milled and shaped by my own hands. 300 pounds of scrap tin, cut and soldered into rodent-proof sheets. 500 pounds of hard winter wheat, purchased on credit from Harlan Jessup, who had finally stopped laughing long enough to see that I might survive after all. The double walls were complete. The tin-lined cavities were sealed. The wheat was poured through access hatches at the top, filling the space between the walls until I could feel the weight of it when I pressed my palm against the interior surface. The day I finished, I stood outside in the meadow and looked at what I had built. From the outside, it looked ordinary. A cabin, a little better built than most, with a solid chimney and a good roof. Nothing special, but I knew what was inside those walls. I walked back inside. The fire had been out for 2 hours. I had let it die while I was doing final work on the exterior. The October air was crisp, cold enough that I could see my breath outside. I pressed my palm against the interior wall. It was warm, not from the fire. The fire had been out for 2 hours. Warm from the grain, from 500 pounds of wheat holding the day's heat, releasing it slowly into the room. From the thermal mass that Marin had written about, that she had tested and measured and logged in her notebooks for 31 years. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor. My hand was still pressed against the warm wood. I could feel the grain through the wall, all that wheat, all that survival, all that proof that my great-aunt had been right about everything. Aunt Marin, I said out loud, you were right. Then I laughed and cried and laughed again. Thomas found me like that an hour later. He came through the door, saw me sitting on the floor with my hand on the wall and tears on my face, and stopped. It works, I said. He walked to the wall, pressed his own palm against it, stood there for a long moment, feeling what I was feeling. Marin Whitmore was the smartest person I ever knew, he said quietly, and she was right about everything, just like I always knew she was. He looked down at me. His face was older than when I'd first met him. A year and a half had passed, and he was 73 now, and every month I could see him slowing down a little more, but his eyes were bright. You did it, he said. You built what she designed. You proved that it works. I shook my head. The cabin works, the grain works, but I haven't proved anything yet. Thomas raised an eyebrow. The real test hasn't come, I said. This is just one winter, one cabin, one woman. It doesn't prove anything until it's tested under real pressure, until it survives something that would break a normal system. Thomas smiled, that small, barely there smile that meant he was pleased but didn't want to show it. Then I guess we'd better get ready, he said, because the mountain doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. It just comes. He was right. But what I didn't know, what neither of us knew, was that the real test was still 2 years away. And when it came, it would test more than just the cabin. It would test everything I believed about who I was and what I was willing to give. Thomas lived another 18 months after the cabin was finished. I didn't know that October day when we stood with our hands on the warm wall that I was counting time I couldn't afford to lose. He was 73 years old. He moved slower every month. Some mornings his hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a file. But he kept coming, kept teaching, kept sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and watching the hollow like he was memorizing it. I had a son, he told me one evening, when the light was fading and we were sitting on the porch steps. Daniel, He was 26 when he died. A rolling log caught him wrong. I was 50 feet away, and I heard the sound it made when it hit him. I hear it still some nights. He was quiet for a long moment. My wife Mary couldn't live with it. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped talking to me. 6 months after Daniel died, I woke up and found her cold beside me. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I sold the mill after that, drank away the money, spent 4 years waiting to die. He looked at me. Then I heard about a girl trying to work the Whitmore sawmill alone, and I thought maybe I was waiting for something else. Maybe I was supposed to teach one more person before I went. He took a sip of his coffee. His hands trembled, but he didn't spill. Your great-aunt used to say the mountain doesn't care who you are. She was right about that. But she was wrong about one thing. What? She said the mountain only cares what you build. That's not quite true. He looked out at the hollow, at the sawmill, at the cabin with its grain-filled walls. The mountain also cares what you pass on, what you teach, what survives after you're gone. He died 6 months before the blizzard, May 1911. I came out to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and found him already sitting in his chair, his eyes closed, his face peaceful. The coffee he'd brought himself was still warm in his hand. He had died watching the sunrise over the hollow, looking at the sawmill he had helped me rebuild. I sat with him for an hour. I held his hand until it was cold. Then I dug his grave on the ridge above the cabin, the spot where he used to sit and look down at the hollow when his back hurt too much to work. I buried him in his good shirt, the one he'd worn the first day he came to help. I planted a white oak acorn in the fresh dirt. I read the letter he'd left for me, written in handwriting that shook worse than mine ever had. You are not alone. You never were. Marin is with you in those notebooks. I am with you in the sawmill song. And someday, someone will come to learn from you. Teach them what we taught you. The mountain doesn't care who you are. It only cares what you build and what you pass on. I went back to work that afternoon, because that's what Thomas would have wanted, because the mountain doesn't wait for grief, because there was still work to do before winter. I didn't know that the winter coming would be the worst in 50 years. The 2 years between the cabin's completion and the blizzard were the busiest of my life. I expanded the system. One cabin wasn't enough. I needed storage, reserves, capacity beyond my own survival. Following Marin's notes, I built an outbuilding with grain wall construction, 1,200 pounds of wheat sealed in the walls, accessible through plugs, enough to supply more than just myself. The work was brutal. I processed another 3,000 board feet of lumber. I shaped and soldered tin until my fingers knew the metal better than my own skin. I hauled wheat from Sutton, 25 pounds at a time, walking 9 miles each way until Harlan finally gave me credit for a mule. By summer 1910, my hands didn't look like a girl's hands anymore. They were calloused, scarred, permanently roughened by work. Thomas had said I had my aunt's hands now. He was right. The seasons turned, spring flooding that tested the sawmill's foundations. I reinforced them with stone, working in water up to my knees. Summer heat that made the metalwork dangerous. I burned myself twice, badly enough to scar. Autumn racing against the first frost to seal the outbuilding before the cold came. Winter forcing indoor work, planning, calculations, reading Marin's notebooks again and again to make sure I hadn't missed anything. I measured everything. The interior temperature of the cabin, 52 degrees when outside it was 8 below zero. The fuel consumption, 20 cords of wood for the winter compared to the 35 my neighbors used. The grain preservation rate, 0% loss to rodents, less than 2% to moisture. The numbers proved what Marin had designed and what I had built. But the community didn't believe in numbers. Late summer 1909, I walked to Sutton for supplies. Harlan Jessup saw me at the counter, still buying tin sheeting, still asking about wheat prices, still alive despite everything he'd predicted. "You still up there, girl?" He leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. "Still playing with that crazy cabin? I give you credit. Most folks would have given up by now, but you're going to freeze to death this winter just like your aunt. That's what happens to Whitmore women." 3 other customers were watching. I could feel their eyes on me. My aunt didn't freeze to death, I said. She died warm in her cabin, in her chair, after 30 years of living alone in that hollow. She died of a stroke, not cold, not hunger. The cabin she built kept her alive until her body gave out. Harlan snorted. That's not what I heard. Then you heard wrong. I looked him in the eye. I'm going to live longer than 30 years in that hollow, Mr. Jessup, and I'm going to remember everything you said when I do. He laughed. Everyone in the store laughed. I bought my tin sheeting and walked 9 miles back to the cabin with their laughter following me like a shadow. But that winter, my first full winter in the completed cabin, something shifted. Harlan's wife's cousin, Margaret, made the walk to Whitmore Hollow in January. Church charity, she said. Donated blankets for the poor Whitmore girl who was surely freezing to death up there alone. She stepped inside my cabin and stopped in the doorway. It's warm, she said. Her voice was strange, confused, almost offended. It's warmer than my house. I have 2 fireplaces. I showed her the wall, explained the grain, watched her face change from confusion to something I couldn't quite read. She left an hour later without giving me the blankets. I found out later she told everyone in town what she'd seen. The crazy Whitmore girl's cabin was warmer than any house in Sutton. The walls were full of wheat. She'd touched them, and they were warm. The story spread. By spring, people were talking. By summer, they were curious. I started trading that year, excess lumber from the sawmill, not much, but enough to bring in a few dollars a month. Preserved vegetables from the garden I'd planted in Marin's old beds. Wild herbs I gathered from the forest and dried in the cabin's warm interior. I wasn't prospering, but I was surviving. And in Braxton County, survival was its own kind of proof. Vernon Sykes arrived in autumn of 1910. I had heard of him before I met him, a timber speculator from Charleston who'd been buying up abandoned properties across the county. He wanted land, logging rights, water access. He wanted everything that people couldn't afford to keep. He came to my cabin with 2 men. They rode up on horses, which meant they had money. They looked at my property the way a butcher looks at a carcass, calculating what could be cut away and sold. Miss Whitmore. Vernon was a tall man, thin, with a face that smiled too easily. I've heard a lot about you. The girl who's trying to make something of the Whitmore coffin. It's not a coffin, it's a homestead. Of course, of course. He dismounted, walked toward me with his hands spread wide like he was approaching a skittish animal. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to help. A woman alone in these mountains, it's not safe. Anything could happen. A fire, a flood, a wrong step on a slippery bank. I felt the threat beneath his words. I kept my face still. I'm offering $20 for the property, Vernon said. Cash. Today. More money than you've ever seen, I'd wager. You could start fresh somewhere else, somewhere safer. $20 was more money than I'd ever seen. It was more than my father had earned in 2 months of logging work. It could buy passage out of Braxton County, out of West Virginia, to somewhere that didn't know my name. No. Vernon's smile flickered. I don't think you understand the situation, Miss Whitmore. This land is valuable. The timber rights alone are worth. I understand the situation perfectly. I had been splitting wood when they arrived. The axe was still in my hand. This hollow belonged to my great-aunt for 30 years. It belongs to me now, and I don't plan to sell. Vernon's eyes went to the axe, then back to my face. The 2 men behind him shifted in their saddles. You think you're special? Vernon's voice lost its friendliness. You think you're different from the others? This land breaks people. It broke your crazy aunt. It'll break you too. And when it does, I'll buy what's left from your creditors for less than I'm offering now. My aunt wasn't broken. She died of old age in a cabin that kept her warm and fed through every winter the mountain threw at her. I raised the axe slightly, not threateningly, just enough to remind them it was there. Get off my property, Mr. Sykes. He got off my property, but he looked back as he rode away, and I knew I hadn't seen the last of him. Dr. Eleanor Marsh arrived in autumn of 1911, 2 months before the blizzard. She was a professor of agricultural science from West Virginia University, she said. She'd come to Braxton County to study food preservation techniques in mountain communities, and she'd heard rumors, strange rumors, about an unusual grain storage system in Whitmore Hollow. She was the first person who looked at my cabin and understood what she was seeing. Miss Whitmore. She stood in the center of the room, touching the walls, measuring the temperature with a thermometer she'd brought from Morgantown. I have studied food storage and preservation for 15 years. I've visited farms across 3 states. I have never seen anything like this. She asked questions for hours about the wall construction, the tin lining, the grain cavity, about the temperature differential I'd measured between inside and outside, about the moisture content of the stored wheat. She tested it herself with equipment I'd never seen before. Your great-aunt was a genius, she said finally. The principles she developed, the thermal mass of grain, the rodent-proof tin lining, the accessibility through interior plugs. This is revolutionary. This could change how mountain families survive the winter. She looked at me with something like awe. Why doesn't anyone know about this? They know, I said. They just don't believe it. Dr. Marsh shook her head. They will. After I write my paper, they will. She left 2 days later, promising to return in spring. She was going to document the system, she said. Publish her findings. Make sure Maren Whitmore's work was recognized. I watched her wagon disappear down the hollow and thought, maybe she's right. Maybe the paper will change things. But I didn't know that something else was coming, something that would prove the system better than any paper ever could. The wells were reliable that year. Everyone's wells were reliable. The grain stores were full across the valley. Nobody was worried about winter. Nobody except me. The first storm arrived on November 22nd, 1911. Temperature dropped from 38 degrees to -7 in a single night. The wind came down from the ridgeline like something alive and angry, and the snow started falling before dawn and didn't stop until 3 feet had buried everything in the hollow. By the second morning, the road to Sutton was impassable. I stood on my porch and looked at the white wall that had risen overnight around my property. The sawmill was a shape beneath the snow. The outhouse had disappeared entirely. The world had gone quiet in a way that felt like a held breath. This is it, I thought. This is the test. The snow kept falling. By the end of the first week, families in Sutton were rationing food. By the end of the second week, wells started freezing. The Petersons' well went first. Their house sat in a low spot, and the cold had seeped deeper there. Then the Hendersons' well. Then the Morrisons'. By the third week, the rats came. They had always been there, of course. Rats live wherever people live. But the cold drove them indoors in numbers no one had seen before. They found every crack, every gap, every weakness in the standard cabin construction. They found the grain stores and started eating. Harlan Jessup's hardware store had a cellar full of emergency grain. The rats got into it by week 3. They ate 40% before anyone noticed. By the time Harlan found them, the rest was contaminated with droppings. Unusable. Week 4, the county tried to send emergency supplies. The roads were impassable. The wagons couldn't get through. Sutton was on its own. By week 6, 2 children were hospitalized with malnutrition-related illness. The doctor had nothing to give them but boiled water and hope. Week 8, the Pattersons' house went silent. The elderly couple had run out of food, run out of fuel, run out of strength. When someone finally dug through the snow to check on them, they found bodies frozen in their beds. I heard about this later in fragments from the people who came to my door. During the blizzard itself, I knew only what I could see: the snow falling, the temperature dropping, my cabin holding steady. 54 degrees inside when it was -18 outside. The grain walls doing exactly what Maren had designed them to do, holding the heat, releasing it slowly, keeping the interior warm without burning through my wood supply. 0 rodent damage. The tin-lined walls kept them out. I could hear them sometimes, scratching at the exterior, trying to find a way in. They never did. And the wheat? The 500 pounds of wheat sealed in my walls, the 1,200 pounds in the outbuilding was perfect, dry, preserved, ready. By late January, I had started grinding and eating from my reserves. Not because I had to, my other food stores were holding, but because I wanted to test the system under real conditions. The flour I made was perfect. The bread I baked was warm. I was surviving. But everywhere around me, people were dying. Sarah Henderson arrived at my door in early February. I didn't recognize her at first. She was covered in ice, her hair, her eyebrows, the front of her coat. She had walked 3 miles through waist-deep snow. Her children weren't with her, which meant they were too sick to travel. Her husband wasn't with her, which meant something was wrong with him too. She was crying before she said a word. I don't have the right to ask. Her voice cracked with cold and exhaustion. After what we did, after how we put you out. But my children are sick, and my husband is snowblind from trying to dig out the well, and we haven't had food in 6 days, and I don't know what else to do. Sarah Henderson. Her husband Jonas had decided I was too much trouble to feed when their crops failed. They had put me out in October, given me a bundle of my own clothes and $2, and sent me to the widow Parsons. I had been 12 years old. I could have reminded her. I could have made her beg. I could have asked her how it felt now to have nothing. Instead, I said, "Come inside." I led her to the interior wall of the cabin. I knelt down and pulled out one of the wooden plugs that Marin had designed, the plugs that made the grain accessible without breaking down the wall. The wheat flowed out in a steady stream, golden, dry, perfect. I filled Sarah's sack, 20 pounds, maybe 25, enough for her family for 2 weeks if they were careful. Why? Sarah was still crying. After what we did, why would you? Your children didn't put me out, I said. Your children are hungry, and this wheat doesn't know who built it or who's eating it. It just keeps people alive. That's what it's for. That's all it's for. She left carrying the sack on her back, walking back into the snow. She came back the next day with her neighbor. The day after that, 6 families came. By the end of February, I had fed 11 families from my walls and from the outbuilding. I removed plug after plug, filled sack after sack, watched the grain level drop inside the cavities. The Morrisons came, the family with 2 children, the youngest just 3 years old. They had eaten their seed corn. They had eaten their livestock feed. They had almost eaten their leather boots. The Jessops came. Harlan himself, with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor. He didn't apologize for what he'd said. He couldn't bring himself to speak at all. He just stood there while I filled his sack, and when I handed it to him, he nodded once and left without a word. And Vernon Sykes came. His logging camps had collapsed under the snow. His workers had scattered. The man who had threatened me with fires and floods and wrong steps on slippery banks was standing in my cabin with empty hands and an empty sack. I need grain, he said. He couldn't look at me. I can pay when this is over. I filled his sack. You don't owe me anything, I said. This is what the grain is for. Go home. Survive. He left without another word. He never tried to buy my land again. I thought about what Thomas would have said during those long weeks of giving. I could hear his voice sometimes in the quiet moments when I was alone with the dropping grain levels and the knowledge that I might run out. Your great-aunt didn't build this for revenge. She built it because she knew what winter was. She knew people would need help. And she knew that the kind of person who could survive alone was also the kind of person who would share. By the time the last snow fell on February the 14th, 1912, I had given away over 200 pounds of wheat. My reserves were down to 40%. If the blizzard had lasted another month, I would have run out. But it didn't last another month, and I didn't run out. And 11 families survived because of grain that had been sealed in my walls, preserved by tin sheeting, kept safe by a system that a woman named Marin Whitmore had designed 30 years before anyone knew they would need it. The mountain doesn't care who you are. It only cares what you build and what you give away. Mrs. Cornelius arrived in November of 1912, 9 months after the blizzard ended. I didn't recognize her at first. She had lost her position at the children's home. There had been a scandal about food rations, about children going hungry while she ate well. She was 61 years old, and she had nowhere to go. She appeared at my door with nothing but a carpet bag, having walked 15 miles from Sutton. Her gray dress was mud-stained. Her face, which had always looked like a closed door, now looked like a door that had been forced open by something it couldn't fight. I let her in. I gave her a chair by the stove. I made her tea. For a long time, she didn't speak. She just sat there, warming herself, looking around the cabin like she was trying to understand what she was seeing. Then she said, "I threw away her letters." I didn't understand. "Whose letters?" "Your great-aunt's letters." She didn't look at me. 3 of them. She wrote to the children's home asking about any surviving Whitmore children. She wanted to leave you this place. She wanted to teach you herself. The room went very quiet. "I thought she was mad," Mrs. Cornelius continued. "I thought I was protecting you from a mad woman's fantasies. So I threw the letters away without reading them, without telling you, without telling anyone." She reached into her carpetbag and pulled out a water-stained envelope. Her hands were shaking. "I kept this one, the 4th one. I don't know why. Perhaps I knew even then that I was wrong." I took the envelope, opened it. Inside was a single page, covered in Marin's precise handwriting. "I am writing one last time about the Whitmore girl. I'm old and will not survive many more winters. I've built something here that works. I've written down everything I know. This knowledge is not mine to take to the grave. Please, let me meet her. Let me show her what a woman alone can build." My hands were shaking now, too. Marin had asked for me, by name. She had wanted to teach me herself. She had died not knowing that I was 8 miles away, waiting in an institution run by a woman who threw her letters in the fire. I looked at Mrs. Cornelius, this woman who had controlled every aspect of my life for 14 months, who had rationed food like punishment, who had called my great-aunt crazy and sent me to the Whitmore coffin expecting me to die. "I forgive you," I said. She looked up, startled. "Not because you deserve it," I said. "Because I do. Because carrying anger is like carrying stones uphill, and I have too much work to do to carry stones." I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket. "My aunt didn't build this cabin for revenge. She built it so the next woman wouldn't be alone. And you're alone now, aren't you?" Mrs. Cornelius nodded. She was crying. I had never seen her cry before. "You can stay," I said, "for as long as you need." The spring after the blizzard, Dr. Marsh published her paper. It appeared in the West Virginia Agricultural Extension Service Bulletin, with diagrams and measurements and careful documentation. The Whitmore method, she called it, a revolutionary approach to grain storage and thermal insulation for mountain homesteads. Representatives came from the university. Photographers took pictures of the cabin, the walls, the wooden plugs. Marin Whitmore's name appeared in print for the first time, credited, finally, for the work she had done alone in this hollow for 31 years. The visitors kept coming after that. Farmers who wanted to learn, scientists who wanted to measure, journalists who wanted to write about the girl who had survived the great blizzard by filling her walls with wheat. I taught everyone who asked. That's what Thomas had told me to do. That's what Marin had wanted. The knowledge wasn't mine to keep. The years after the blizzard passed quickly. That's how time works when you're building something. I married in 1915, James Whitmore, a distant cousin, no relation except the name. He was a school teacher from Sutton who walked to my cabin every Sunday for 2 years to read with me before he worked up the courage to propose. He was the first person who asked me what I was reading instead of telling me to stop. We had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. They all learned the grain wall method before they could read, just as I had learned it from Marin's notebooks. By 1920, I had taught the method to 47 families across the county. By 1930, it was in the Extension Service manual. By 1950, people came from 3 states to see the cabin and learned from the woman who had proved that the crazy Whitmore lady had been right all along. Thomas's white oak grew tall on the ridge above the cabin. I visited it every year on the anniversary of his death, and I told him what had happened since the last time, the families I'd taught, the buildings that had been razed, the children who had survived winters that would have killed them otherwise. I got old in that hollow. My hands learned the cabin the way a musician knows an instrument. I could tell you the grain level in any wall by the sound my knuckles made against the wood. James died in 1954, quietly, in the bed we had shared for 39 years. I buried him next to Thomas on the ridge where they could both watch over the hollow. I kept teaching until I couldn't teach anymore, and even then people came. They sat on my porch and listened to me talk about thermal mass and tin sealing and the importance of keeping wheat below 13% moisture. They took notes the way I had once taken notes from Marin's journals. The mountain doesn't care who you are. It only cares what you build and what you pass on. I died on a March morning in 1969, 78 years old, quietly, in my sleep, in the cabin I had built with my own hands. My granddaughter Clara found me. She said later that I looked peaceful, that I looked like I was listening to something, like I was waiting for someone to come teach. The cabin is still standing. The walls are still full of grain. Students from the university come every year to study it, to measure it, to learn how a woman alone solved the problem of winter with nothing but notebooks and stubbornness, and the willingness to try what no one else believed would work. Marin's thematic quote is carved into a plaque above the fireplace now. They will tell you that a woman alone cannot survive the mountain. They are wrong. The mountain does not care who you are. It only cares what you have built. Build something true, and the mountain will keep you alive. I think about the courtroom sometimes. No, not a courtroom. The children's home. The wooden benches and the high windows and the smell of lye soap and boiled cabbage. Mrs. Cornelius standing at the podium reading the inheritance letter, her voice dripping with contempt. The Whitmore coffin. How fitting. Every Whitmore woman has died on that land, and now the county can stop paying for your meals while you go join them. I suppose even the dead need company. She was wrong. The dead were already with me. They were teaching me the whole time. Marin in her notebooks, Thomas in the Sawmills song, Emmeline in the memory of what happens when you can't survive the winter. They were all with me, and now I'm with them. And the cabin is still standing, still warm, still waiting for whoever comes next. So let me ask you something. What walls are you building? Not literal walls, though maybe those too, but the walls of your life. What are you filling them with? What are you storing for the winter that's coming? Because winter always comes. Maybe not snow and cold. Maybe it's something else. Sickness, loss. The moment when everything you thought was solid turns out to be hollow. Everyone faces a blizzard eventually. The only question is what you've built to survive it. What did someone tell you about yourself that you believed? What inheritance did they call worthless? What project did they mock? What dream did they say was crazy? I was 16 years old. I had $2.37. I had watched my sister starve. I had been passed from family to family like a burden no one wanted to carry. And the most powerful woman in my world looked me in the eye and told me I was going to die. She was wrong. Not because I was special, not because I was braver or smarter or stronger than anyone else, but because someone had built something before me, because Marin Whitmore had spent 31 years filling notebooks with knowledge, waiting for someone to come and use it, because Thomas Harkins had walked 9 miles to teach a girl he'd never met, because the people who came before me had passed something on. That's what matters, not what people say about you, not what they call your inheritance, not whether they laugh when you tell them what you're building. What matters is whether you build it anyway. The conditions don't have to be perfect. They almost never are. Marin started with a collapsed cabin and $11. I started with a flour sack and $2.37. The people who taught me started with their own losses, their own failures, their own grief. You start with what you have. You build with what you can find. You pass on what you learn. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own walls and what you're filling them with, hit subscribe. There are more stories here about ordinary people who built extraordinary things out of the nothing they were given, and then go build something. Somewhere in your life there are walls waiting to be filled. There is wheat waiting to be stored. There is warmth waiting to be held. Build something true, and the mountain will keep you alive. Your walls are waiting. Start filling them. Start as